The hospital door slid open. No one waited outside. My son answered only on the fifth ring and hissed, "Stay right where you are." I drove home in a battered rental, every pothole tugging at fresh stitches. I knocked on my own window while my daughter-in-law giggled. Let the old bat find a nursing home. Rain lashed the porch, mingling with humiliation on my lips. I didn't yet know my house key would never turn again. Matilda Johnson awoke to a dull ache beneath her ribs and the soft beeping of monitors in the dim hospital room. Dawn's light crept through the blinds, but even its gentle glow couldn't fully chase away the chill of the night's loneliness. She blinked, disoriented for a moment, then remembered. The surgery was over. Thank God it's over, she thought wearily. At 67, surgery was no small ordeal, but she had come through. Now all she wanted was to go home, to the familiar comfort of her own bed and the embrace of her son's promised visit. Wrapped in a thin hospital gown and a threadbare robe, Matilda carefully pushed herself up against the pillows. A lance of pain shot through her right side where the doctors had removed her gallbladder just 2 days before. She winced, pressing a hand gently to the bandaged area beneath her ribs. Every movement was a reminder that she wasn't as young and spry as she once was. Yet, despite the soreness, a small, hopeful smile played on her lips. Today, she was supposed to be discharged. Today, her son Darnell had promised he would come take her home. She reached for her cell phone on the bedside table with a trembling hand. The nurse had said the paperwork would be ready by morning, and it was now just past 7 a.m. He should be on his way by now, Matilda reassured herself, carefully unplugging the phone from its charger. The background photo on the screen lit up. It was a picture of her and Darnell from a few years ago at the Birmingham church picnic, both of them smiling in the bright summer sun. Her heart swelled at that memory, her son towering over her with a grin, his arm draped protectively around her shoulders. He had always been a good boy, a loving son. Through the haze of sleep and medication, she clung to that feeling of warmth. It helped keep the creeping anxiety at bay. Outside in the hallway, she could hear nurses exchanging shift reports and the low rumble of a janitor's cart rolling by. The world was waking up, and soon she hoped to be free of this antiseptic room with its constant interruptions and fluorescent lights. Matilda gingerly swung her legs over the side of the bed, planting her feet in her slippers. A slight tremor of effort went through her. She wasn't fully steady yet, but she insisted on getting mostly dressed and ready. She wanted to look presentable when Darnell arrived. On the chair beside the bed lay the neatly folded clothes a neighbor had dropped off for her the day before. A clean blouse and Matilda's favorite navy blue skirt. With slow, deliberate movements, Matilda began to dress, tugging the blouse down carefully to avoid disturbing her sore abdomen. Each motion cost effort, but she refused to be seen leaving this hospital looking frail or pitiful. She had her pride, a quiet dignity that kept her chin up even when she was weak. As she buttoned the last button with fingers that fumbled from weakness, Matilda glanced again at her phone. No missed calls or messages from Darnell yet. That was a bit odd. He usually texted her when he was on his way. Perhaps he was driving and couldn't answer, she reasoned. Or maybe he'd had trouble getting the twins ready for school. Twins? Matilda's brow furrowed slightly. Darnell and his wife Chantel didn't have children, so that thought was out of place. In truth, she couldn't think of a solid reason for any delay. He had known for days that she'd be coming home this morning. She sank back onto the bed for a moment, the small spark of worry flaring a little brighter in her mind. Why hadn't he called or shown up yet? It was unlike him to be late or out of touch when it mattered. At least, the old Darnell she knew would never have left her waiting without a word. Matilda took a deep breath, reminding herself not to jump to conclusions. People get caught up. Things happen. Maybe traffic was bad or his phone battery died. There was always an explanation, she thought. Darnell loved her. He was her only child, and though he had his own busy life, she believed he would never truly let her down. Still, the hospital discharge time was approaching. Matilda decided she should give him a quick call just to check in. She scrolled through her contacts with a slightly unsteady thumb until she found Darnell, son, and pressed the call button. Bringing the phone to her ear, she listened as it rang. Once, twice, 3 times. No answer. The call went to voicemail. Matilda pulled the phone away and stared at it, perplexed. Perhaps he was driving and couldn't pick up. She mused again, trying to quell the unease tightening her chest. She left a calm, brief message to me, something simple like, "Hi, baby, I'm ready to be picked up. Call me back when you get this. Love you." Her voice was steady, betraying none of the tiny tremors of doubt that had begun to surface. After hanging up, she set the phone down and exhaled slowly. At that moment, a cheerful young nurse breezed in, carrying a clipboard. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," the nurse chirped. "Looks like you're all set to go home today." "Are you excited to bust out of here?" Matilda mustered a smile. "Oh, yes, honey, I sure am," she replied in her warm, gentle drawl. "Can't wait to breathe some fresh air and be in my own house." The nurse began unhooking the IV line from Matilda's arm. "Is someone coming to pick you up? Or should we call a transport service for you?" she asked casually, scanning through the discharge instructions on the clipboard. "My son is coming," Matilda answered, trying to sound confident. Saying it aloud gave her comfort. Of course Darnell was coming. "He should be here any minute now, I expect." She smoothed an errant strand of gray hair back into place and straightened up a little, as if preparing to greet him. "Wonderful," the nurse said and patted her hand. "I'll go get your paperwork and final meds. You take your time getting ready. There's no rush." As the nurse left, Matilda felt that familiar swell of gratitude and maternal pride when she thought of her son. He was a grown man now, but in her heart, he was still that little boy bringing home crayon drawings from Sunday school. He'd had his struggles. Losing his father, James, 5 years ago had been hard on both of them, but they'd grown closer through their grief. Darnell had stepped up to look after her in the immediate months after James's passing, making sure she took her medicines and ate properly. That was why she felt certain he would be here today, as promised. Yet time was ticking on. Matilda folded her hospital gown neatly and placed it on the bed, then perched on the edge, fully dressed and ready, her small overnight bag at her feet. She dialed Darnell again, just in case. The phone rang, and rang. Still no answer. She bit her lower lip. A niggling thought crept in. Could he have forgotten? No. She immediately dismissed that. He wouldn't forget his own mother in the hospital. Maybe he was tied up with something urgent at work. Working in real estate kept him busy at odd hours, she knew. Perhaps a morning meeting ran long. "All right," Matilda whispered to herself, trying to ease the knot in her stomach. "I'll give him a little more time." She tried to ignore the slight quiver in her voice. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each minute of silence making the room feel colder. Matilda clutched her phone in her lap, the edges digging into her palms as she waited. A faint worry began to shadow her thoughts, but she kept shooing it away. Outside her window, the autumn sky was overcast with a blanket of gray clouds. Rain was in the air. She could smell it, that damp, earthy scent that sometimes precedes a southern storm. A nurse rolled a wheelchair into the room and parked it by the bed for when she was ready to leave. The sight of it made Matilda's heart quicken. She wasn't about to be wheeled out to the curb alone. Darnell would arrive. He had to. Taking a steadying breath, she lifted the phone a third time. Each unanswered call tightened the knot of dread in her stomach. She tapped his number again and once more listened anxiously to the rings echoing in her ear. Once more the call went to voicemail. This time she didn't leave a message. Her fingers felt cold as she lowered the phone and looked at the blank screen. Something was wrong. Why wasn't he picking up? Matilda's thumb hovered over the call button yet again. She had already tried Darnell's number twice more in the last 15 minutes, and each time had met only silence and the click of his voicemail. With each attempt, the quiet dread inside her grew. She tried to swallow the fear, but her mouth had gone dry as cotton. Could he have truly forgotten about her? That notion seemed impossible, almost absurd, and yet the alternative explanations felt thin. Clutching the phone, Matilda shut her eyes for a moment to steady herself. "Lord, give me patience," she whispered under her breath, a quiet prayer slipping out. Her quiet plea hung in the sterile air, unanswered, at least for now. When she opened her eyes, she saw the young nurse watching her from the doorway, concern knitting the girl's brow. "Everything all right, Miss Johnson?" the nurse asked gently. She had the discharge papers in hand and a puzzled look on her face, no doubt wondering why Matilda was still sitting on the bed instead of eagerly wheeling herself out to meet her ride. Matilda managed a tight smile. "I'm fine, dear," she replied, trying to sound convincing. She didn't want to alarm anyone or admit that her ride hadn't shown. Pride kept her from revealing the situation. She couldn't bear the pity in a stranger's eyes if they knew her own son might have left her waiting. "My son should be here any minute," she added, straightening her skirt again with nervous fingers. "He probably just got a little held up." The nurse nodded slowly, still looking unconvinced. "Well, no rush," she said, stepping in to set the paperwork on the bedside table. "If you need me to call someone for you, let us know, okay? We can always arrange a hospital shuttle." "Oh, that won't be necessary," Matilda interjected quickly, her voice perhaps sharper than intended. She softened it with a grateful nod. "But thank you kindly. I'll be all right." With a last hesitant smile, the nurse left her in peace. As soon as the door closed, Matilda's facade of calm confidence faltered. Her reflection in the blank phone screen looked back at her, a tired, worried face framed by short, silvery curls. She hardly recognized herself in that moment. "Pull yourself together," she chided internally. "He said he'd come. He gave you his word." She tried to recall Darnell's exact words when they had spoken a few days ago about her discharge. He'd sounded a bit distracted on that call, but he did say, "I'll arrange to pick you up, Mama." Don't you worry about a thing she had assumed he meant it. Why would she doubt it? Still, something about that conversation had left her unsettled at the time, though she'd brushed it off. She remembered mentioning how lovely the autumn roses in her front yard must be looking now. There had been a pause, and then Darnell changed the subject quickly. It struck her as odd. Her son normally indulged her gardening talk, knowing how proud she was of those rose bushes she and James had planted decades ago. Had he even been by the house to water them while she was hospitalized? The thought that her roses might be wilting from neglect made her chest tighten with a mix of worry and a strange premonition. Matilda realized her mind was wandering down dark paths, so she forced herself to refocus on the present. She decided to try calling one more time, a fourth attempt, and resolved that this time she would hear her son's voice. She needed to hear his voice. Her hand trembled as she pressed redial. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Matilda's pulse thudded in her ears with each ring, an echo of her growing anxiety. At last there was a click. She sat bolt upright, heart leaping, but it was only the voicemail greeting again. A small, plaintive beep sounded in her ear, inviting her to leave yet another message. Matilda's composure finally cracked a little. "Darnell," she said into the phone, her tone tight with worry. "It's Mama. I'm waiting for you at the hospital. Are you all right, baby? I really need to hear from you. Please call me." Her voice wavered despite her best effort to keep it even. There was a tremor there now, an unmistakable quiver of a hurt child in the guise of a mother. She hated that it slipped out, but the hurt and confusion were becoming too much to contain. She hung up and drew a shaky breath. The act of leaving that message felt like a surrender of some kind, an admission that something was truly wrong. Matilda clutched her phone to her chest, suddenly feeling a hollowness open up under her ribs that had nothing to do with the surgery. Was she asking too much of him? Over the years, she had prided herself on not burdening her son with her needs. She was the one who helped him, not the other way around. Even after James died, she'd tried to be as independent as possible, despite Darnell and Chantel moving into her home to help her out. She pressed her lips together, recalling the day her son and his wife had settled into her house. It was about a year after James's funeral. At first, the arrangement seemed like a blessing. The house hadn't felt so empty with them around. Darnell had insisted it would be temporary just until they saved up for a place of their own, but Matilda suspected Chantel liked the situation. Her daughter-in-law had gradually redecorated here and there, as if testing the limits of ownership. Matilda remembered coming home from church one Sunday to find her late husband's favorite armchair moved to the garage to make room for a sleek new recliner that Chantel ordered. The chair incident had been smoothed over quickly by Darnell's jokes, but it left a bruise of resentment that never fully healed. Perhaps Matilda thought with a pang she had ignored other warning signs. There were times she'd felt more a guest than the owner in her own home. Little things. Her kitchen rearranged to suit Chantel's tastes, the rose garden neglected when she wasn't able to tend it, hints from her son that maybe the house was too much work for her alone. Just before her surgery, Chantel had mentioned a friend's mother who recovered from an operation in a nursing facility, praising how well it went. Matilda had laughed it off at the time, assuring them she'd be back on her feet and home in no time. Now that memory sent a cold trickle of fear through her veins. A tap on the door broke her reverie. The discharged nurse peeked in once more. "Ms. Johnson, we really need the bed for another patient soon. Do you want me to call someone for you, dear?" Matilda realized she had been sitting there, fully dressed with purse in hand, long after most patients would have left. Embarrassment flushed her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly, standing on unsteady legs. Her side throbbed and she pressed a hand to it. "My son, I'm sure he's just running late." "I'll go on down to the lobby to wait." The nurse frowned kindly and brought the wheelchair closer. "Let's get you downstairs then. We can't let you walk out alone after surgery." Too tired to protest, Matilda eased into the wheelchair. In minutes, she found herself deposited near the hospital's main entrance, her small suitcase in her lap. The lobby bustled with activity. Cheerful volunteers behind the information desk, patients leaving with relatives, a man in scrubs rushing by with a coffee in hand. And there sat Matilda, a solitary figure amid the commotion, scanning every face that passed for her son's familiar features. She waited. And waited. Each time the sliding glass doors hissed open, she lifted her head hopefully, only to see strangers. Minutes crawled by, turning into an hour. Rain began to pepper the sidewalks outside, droplets tapping against the glass walls of the entrance. The autumn storm had arrived, and with it came a creeping chill. Matilda's phone remained silent, not a buzz or ring to break the silence. Enough was enough. Her son had not come, and now the truth pressed heavily on her chest. Something was terribly wrong in a way she could no longer deny. Fighting the sting of tears, Matilda gathered her courage and decided to call him one final time. This would be the 5th call, and if he didn't answer now, she didn't know what she would do next. Her thumb pressed the screen with resolve. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Suddenly, amid the distant roll of thunder outside, she heard the call connect. There was a tiny crackle on the line as someone picked up. Matilda's breath caught. "Hello?" "Mama?" came Darnell's voice at last. Matilda almost sagged in relief, her eyes flooding with unexpected tears. Darnell? Oh, thank heavens," she gasped softly into the phone. "Baby, I've been trying to reach you." "I haven't forgotten, Mom," he interrupted, his tone oddly flat. The words were right, but something in his voice was all wrong. Matilda blinked, confused by the coolness curling around each syllable. This wasn't the warm, concerned son she had expected. Before she could respond, she heard a muffled female giggle in the background. A brief burst of laughter quickly hushed. It sounded like Chantel. Lightning flashed beyond the hospital's front windows, a sharp white glare illuminating the rain-slick sidewalk outside. Matilda's pulse pounded in her throat. Her hand was slippery with sweat against the phone, and she realized she was trembling all over. "Sweetheart, is everything okay?" she ventured carefully, her voice small. There was a heavy pause. Matilda could hear only the pounding of her own heart and the faint static on the line. Her mind raced. Why was Chantel laughing? Were they at home together right now? None of this made sense. He should have been on the road to get her, not cozied up with his wife joking about something. "Darnell," she whispered when the silence stretched uncomfortably. A prickle of dread climbed her spine. The distant thunder rumbled again, as if nature itself were growling a warning. On the other end, Darnell finally inhaled audibly, as if gathering himself. Matilda's hand trembled against the phone, her knuckles white. "Lord, give me strength," she prayed inwardly. "James, I wish you were here with me." Not since the day James died had she felt so utterly alone. And then, in that breathless hush, Darnell finally spoke again, and his next words hit Matilda harder than any storm ever could, poised to shatter Matilda's heart once and for all into a million pieces. For a long moment, Matilda forgot how to breathe. Darnell's words hung in the air between them, sharp and irrevocable. I'm not coming to get you, he had just said, each word slow and deliberate as if speaking to a stranger. Let them keep you there where you belong. On the other end of the line, Matilda heard the faint sound of Chantel's snicker, a cruel little laugh that snapped the last thread of hope in her heart. The call went dead a second later. Darnell had hung up. Matilda sat utterly still in her wheelchair by the hospital entrance, the phone pressed hard against her ear, even though the line was already silent. It was as if her mind refused to process what she just heard. He's not coming. The phrase repeated in her head, but it made no sense, like foreign words she didn't understand. How could her own son abandon her here? How could he say something so hateful, so final? Her hand slowly lowered the phone. She stared at the rain-spattered floor tiles beneath her feet. A sound escaped her lips, and a soft, wounded gasp, the closest thing to a cry that her stunned body could produce. The volunteer who had been watching her jumped up and approached. "Ma'am, are you all right?" the young woman asked, brow creased with concern. Matilda's lips parted, but at first nothing came out. Finally, in a thin voice that didn't sound like hers, she managed to whisper, "My son isn't coming." Saying it aloud made it real in the most brutal way. Each word tasted bitter on her tongue. The volunteer exchanged a shocked glance with the security guard. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she murmured, reaching out as if to touch Matilda's shoulder, then pulling back uncertainly. "Do you want us to call someone for you? A friend or another relative? We can get you a taxi, maybe? Or—" "No," Matilda interrupted. She couldn't bear any more kindness. It would break the fragile composure she had left. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. The last thing she wanted was to become a spectacle of pity in front of strangers. She straightened her back against the wheelchair, blinking rapidly to keep the tears at bay. "Thank you, but that won't be necessary." Her voice grew steadier as she spoke, surprising even herself with its firmness. I'll find my own way home." The volunteer hesitated, eyes flicking to the phone still clenched in Matilda's hand. "Are you sure, ma'am? It's really no trouble to help you." "I'm sure." Matilda's tone left no room for argument. A lifetime of pride and resilience steeled her spine now. She had survived hardship before. The segregation era, as a girl in Alabama, raising a son on a shoestring budget with James, the loss of her husband. She would survive this betrayal too, somehow. She refused to crumble here under these fluorescent lights. With a deep breath, Matilda pushed herself up from the wheelchair. The volunteer moved as if to assist her, but Matilda gently waved her off. The sudden motion sent a bolt of pain through her tender midsection. She swayed and caught the arm of the chair to steady herself. The security guard stepped closer, ready to help if needed. Matilda closed her eyes for a moment, composing herself. The physical ache from surgery was nothing compared to the yawning emptiness opening inside her chest. Still, she forced a tight smile onto her face. "Thank you for your help." "I'm all right," she said softly. Neither the volunteer nor guard looked convinced, but Matilda mustered as much dignity as she could and smoothed the front of her blouse with trembling hands. She felt faint, as if the world had tilted sideways, but sheer willpower kept her standing. Somehow she gathered her belongings, the small suitcase, her purse, and began to walk slowly toward the sliding glass exit doors. Every step jarred her incision, sending a hot stab of pain across her side. Matilda gritted her teeth. The pain, in a strange way, grounded her. It was real and sharp and present, something she could focus on rather than the agonizing words echoing in her head. Beyond the glass doors, the rain poured down in silvery sheets. The late morning sky had darkened as if dusk had arrived early, the storm clouds unleashing their fury on the city. Wind drove the rain at an angle, splattering the covered drop-off area outside the hospital. Matilda paused just under the awning, the chill of the damp air wrapping around her. She had no umbrella, not even a coat, just her thin cardigan draped over her shoulders. Behind her, the volunteer hovered near the entrance, clearly uneasy, letting an elderly woman walk off alone into a storm. Mrs. Johnson, please, at least let me call a cab for you, she pleaded one last time, raising her voice over the drumming of the rain. Matilda turned back, rain misting her face and hair. Thank you, but I'll be fine, she replied, raising her voice firmly. She refused to shed another ounce of her pride, even now. If she waited for a taxi, she feared her composure would shatter in that lobby under their sympathetic gazes. She could not let that happen. She needed to move, to do something, anything but sit and wallow in what had just occurred. With that, Matilda stepped out from under the awning and into the storm alone. Cold October rain drenched her within seconds. She bit down on a gasp as the icy water hit her bandaged wound like needles. Hugging her arms around herself, she made her way to the curb. A few cars idled there, people picking up patients, their windshield wipers flicking frantically. One driver, a middle-aged man loading his wife into their car, glanced at Matilda with concern. She must have been a sight, an older woman, hair getting soaked, standing alone with a suitcase in a downpour. He opened his mouth as if to offer help, but Matilda quickly looked away, pretending not to notice. Her humiliation was complete. She had no room for well-meaning pity from strangers. She took a shaky breath and forced herself to focus on the practical problem at hand. How was she going to get home? Taxis in this weather might take ages, and truthfully, she didn't even have a taxi service number handy. The hospital staff surely had one, but going back inside to ask was out of the question for her pride. A flicker of memory came. An advertisement she'd seen in the hospital lobby for a car rental service that offered special hospital rates. Yes, that was something she could do. If no one would come to drive her, she would drive herself. She had her driver's license, and despite her soreness, she felt confident enough to manage a short trip home. At least it would give her a sense of control in a situation where she otherwise had none. Fumbling with wet fingers, Matilda dug her phone out again and searched for the rental agency's number. The screen was speckled with rain, but after a couple of tries, she got through. In a voice remarkably level, she explained that she needed a car immediately. Within 10 minutes, a representative from the rental company, a young woman holding a clipboard and umbrella, scurried over from their office across the street to meet Matilda under the awning. By the time all the paperwork was hastily signed, Matilda's clothes were damp and clinging to her, and tendrils of gray hair stuck to her cheeks. She hardly noticed. Numbly, she accepted the keys and limped toward the space where the rental clerk pointed out a small blue sedan. The car was at least 20 years old and bore numerous scratches, but Matilda couldn't have cared less if it had been a rusty tin can. It was hers to use, and it meant she didn't have to beg anyone for a ride. As she sank into the driver's seat, a fresh jolt of pain ripped through her abdomen, forcing a sharp hiss from her lips. For a moment she closed her eyes, panting softly, willing the agony to subside. "Lord, give me strength," she prayed silently, gripping the steering wheel. It took a minute or two before she could sit upright without dizziness. At last, she wiped the blur of rain and tears from her eyes and inserted the key into the ignition. The engine coughed to life with a groan. Matilda adjusted the mirrors with quivering hands and then eased the car away from the curb. As she pulled out into the rain-soaked street, her headlights cutting feebly through the gray midday gloom, she finally allowed herself a single sob. It broke free from her throat before she could clamp it down. One raw, short sob of pain, anger, and heartbreak. Only the patter of rain on the car's roof answered her. Matilda pressed her lips together and shook her head fiercely. She would not fall apart. Not yet. They might have cast her aside, but she was still alive and she still had herself. She inhaled a long, trembling breath and kept her teary eyes fixed on the road ahead. Matilda navigated slowly through waterlogged streets, each mile a trial of both body and spirit. Her hands clenched the wheel at 10 and 2, knuckles pale with effort. With every pothole or sudden break, pain flared white-hot in her side, but she bit down on her lip and kept going. The wipers whipped back and forth, fighting the cascade of rain. Through the blur, familiar landmarks of her community emerged. The old Baptist church on the corner, the oak tree that canopied Maple Street, the mailbox clusters, and neatly trimmed lawns. Normally, coming home to her quiet Birmingham suburb brought Matilda comfort. Not tonight. Tonight, every shadow in her neighborhood seemed foreboding. Every warm light in a window a reminder that she had none waiting for her. At last, she turned onto her own street, Magnolia Lane. Her heart thudded anxiously as she approached the modest brown brick house that had been her pride and joy for decades. The house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, usually welcoming with its porch light glowing and the sight of her rose bushes lining the front walk. But as Matilda rolled closer, she immediately sensed something was off. The porch light was indeed on, casting a yellow halo in the rain, but the scene it illuminated made her stomach drop. Her rose garden was gone. Matilda slowed the car to a crawl, peering through the downpour. Yes, the flower beds on either side of the front steps, which James had helped her plant and tend for so many years, were empty. The bushes had been dug up, the soil tamped flat as if nothing had ever grown there. In their place, a few cheap potted ferns sat like afterthoughts. She felt a pang deep in her chest, as though someone had ripped out a piece of her history. Those roses were a living memory of her late husband. Seeing them erased without a word of warning was like losing him all over again. Hands shaking on the wheel, Matilda eased into the driveway. Through the sheets of rain, more unsettling details emerged. A gaudy wooden plaque hung on the front porch where Matilda's hand-painted address sign used to be. The new sign bore a saccharine phrase in curly letters, "Home Sweet Home." It was something one might find at a craft store, charming to a stranger's eye perhaps, but to Matilda it looked utterly foreign and false hanging on her house. Home Sweet Home. The words seemed to mock her now. Matilda cut the engine and sat in silence for a moment, save for the drum of rain on the car roof. Her breath fogged the inside of the windshield. She willed herself to believe this was all a misunderstanding. Perhaps Darnell and Chantel had simply done some yard work, planning to surprise her with new landscaping. Maybe they hung that sign to welcome her back, not understanding how it might make her feel. Yes, surely there was some explanation that wasn't as cruel as it looked. Clutching her ring of keys, Matilda forced herself out of the car. The rain immediately soaked through her skirt and shoes as she hobbled toward the front door. The porch steps were slick, and she had to grasp the railing to haul herself up, her incision burning with exertion. She was shivering violently by the time she stood at the door under the small shelter of the porch roof. For a second, Matilda allowed herself to imagine that in a moment she would turn the knob and step inside to warmth. Maybe Darnell would rush to her apologizing, blaming some misunderstanding or emergency. She wanted so desperately to believe that narrative that her hands moved automatically, selecting her house key from memory and sliding it into the lock. It didn't fit. Frowning, she jiggled the key and tried again. The key slid part way, but the tumblers refused to catch. Matilda's pulse quickened. She knew every quirk of this old lock, how it needed a firm push and twist. But no matter how she angled or pushed, the key wouldn't turn. It was as if it wasn't her lock anymore. She tried a second key on her chain, even though she knew it was pointless. Nothing. A thin cry of panic escaped her lips. They had changed the locks. Matilda's mind raced in disbelief. Who would change the locks on their own mother without telling her? The answer, painfully clear, was the son who had just told her not to come home. Tears of betrayal mingled with the rain on Matilda's face as she pounded softly on the door. Her strength was fading, but she mustered a weak, urgent knock. Darnell, she called, voice cracking. It's me, Mama. Please let me in. For a few seconds, all she heard was the relentless patter of rain and the thudding of her heart. Then, through the front window, which was slightly ajar, a shadow crossed. Matilda's hope surged. Darnell was there. He would open the door now, wouldn't he? They would fix this horrible misunderstanding. But when the response came, it was not her son's face at the door. Instead, Chantel's voice sliced through the storm, high and disdainful. She didn't even bother to open the door wider. She shouted from inside, her tone dripping with malice. You don't live here anymore, old woman? Go find yourself a room at the nursing home. The words struck Matilda like a physical blow. She staggered back a step, one hand flying to her chest. Through the gap in the curtains, she could just make out Chantel's silhouette near the window, but not a glimpse of Darnell. Was he there, hiding in the shadows, letting his wife hurl this cruelty? Matilda's lips trembled. Darnell, she pleaded into the darkness beyond the glass. Please, it's Mama. Just talk to me, baby. There was a brief flicker of movement at the window, perhaps a second figure behind Chantel, but no reply came from her son. Instead, the porch light abruptly clicked off, plunging Matilda into darkness. They had cut the last light, hoping she would disappear like an unwanted stray. Matilda stood there in the black rain, drenched and quaking, not from the cold, but from the shock and anguish consuming her. The house, her house, which she had scrimped and saved for with James, which had been her safe haven for half a lifetime, now stood locked and lifeless before her, as if she were a stranger. In the space of a day, her entire world had emptied out, her family, her home, her sense of belonging, all ripped away by the very people she loved most. For a long moment, she remained frozen on the porch, rainwater streaming down her face like tears she was too stunned to shed. Lightning ignited the sky, illuminating the neat, cold, home sweet home sign above her, its cheerful message now a cruel taunt. Home? There was no home here for her anymore. A numbness crept over Matilda. She realized there would be no miracle, no last-minute change of heart opening this door. Darnell truly meant to shut her out of his life. A sob rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down with great difficulty. She would not give Chantel the satisfaction of hearing her break. Wrapping her arms around herself, Matilda stepped slowly backward off the porch. Her legs nearly buckled as she descended the steps, each movement sending agony ripping through her side. She cast one last glance at the dark front window where her son might be standing just out of sight. The urge to scream his name, to curse, or to beg, anything to force a reaction, welled up inside her. But there was only silence from within that house, the kind of silence that follows a door being firmly and permanently shut. Matilda turned and made her way back to the rental car, which sat idling with its headlights glowing faintly through the downpour. She was soaked to the bone and shaking uncontrollably now. When she finally collapsed into the driver's seat, she didn't have the strength to do anything but rest her forehead on the steering wheel. Her body heaved with ragged breaths as the enormity of what had just happened crashed over her. Her own child had erased her from his life. That realization cut deeper than any surgical knife. It stole whatever remnants of strength she had left. Matilda sat in the dark car for what felt like an eternity, the rain hammering on the roof like the drumbeat of her despair. Each thud of water against metal echoed the refrain in her mind, not welcome, not wanted, not loved. Lightning flashed and thunder rolled directly overhead, jolting Matilda from her daze. She had to get away from here, from this house that was no longer home, from this street, where neighbors might see her humiliation. With a trembling hand, she shifted the car into reverse and backed out of the driveway. The tires splashed through puddles as she pulled onto the road, leaving behind the dark shell of the house that had once been filled with love and laughter. As she drove away, Matilda dared one final tear-blurred look at the place that had been her whole world. It looked so small and distant now in the rearview mirror, a hollow imposter of the warm home she cherished. A jagged bolt of lightning split the sky above it, and in the stark white glare the house was illuminated one last time, home sweet home glaring on the porch, before darkness swallowed it. Matilda did not even recall how she managed to drive to the Travelers' Inn on the outskirts of town. One moment she had been wandering aimlessly through the dark, the next the flickering neon vacancy sign of a roadside motel beckoned to her through the downpour. She pulled into the gravel lot as the sign's pink glow reflected off the rain-streaked windshield. Numbly, Matilda gathered her purse and stepped out into the storm once more, shuffling toward the tiny front office of the motel. Matilda signed the register with a steady hand she didn't truly feel. The clerk politely handed over a key and directed her to room 7. He asked no questions about her drenched state, and Matilda volunteered no explanation. Moments later, she stood alone in a small, musty room smelling of old carpet and faint bleach. As she closed the door behind her, the silence was deafening. Only then, in the privacy of that dim room, did the full weight of the day press down on her. Her heart felt like it had been smashed to pieces, and she wept silently, the flood of pain finally breaking free. In her solitude, she whispered into the darkness, "Lord, why have they forsaken me? What did I do wrong?" But no answer came, only the drum of rain on the motel's awning. Hot tears rolled down her cheeks as her shoulders shook with sobs. Matilda barely registered anything around her now. Her whole world had narrowed to the voice on the phone. Outside, the rain battered the pavement, a steady drumming that matched the rush of blood in her ears. She fleetingly considered calling one of her church friends or a neighbor for help, but shame held her back. How could she explain what had happened? How could she admit that the son she'd always praised had left her like this? At this late hour in this weather, she could not bear to reach out only to burst into tears on the phone. She felt utterly alone. It wasn't home, but it would have to do as a refuge for the night. There was nowhere else. Inside that motel office, under the flickering neon light, Matilda had signed the register and obtained a key. Within minutes, she was ensconced in the plain, dry safety of room 7. Matilda reached into her purse and touched the folded letter from James, drawing strength from his words. She exhaled a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. This decision carved a new path from the wreckage of her old hopes. Though sorrow still lingered, it was now tempered by a sense of vindication and an unexpected peace that her future was now under her control. Finally, hours past midnight, Matilda's tears ran dry. She sank onto the edge of the motel bed, still in her damp clothes and coat. The effort of changing or even pulling back the covers felt beyond her. Hugging a thin pillow to her chest, she curled up on top of the scratchy bedspread. Now that the adrenaline had ebbed, her abdomen throbbed with every heartbeat, the pain asserting itself in the silence. She winced and placed a protective hand over the bandage beneath her blouse, but there was little she could do. Not tonight. She stared blankly at the stained ceiling, her mind replaying each awful moment of the day on a looping reel. With it came the crushing realization that aside from the overnight bag she'd brought to the hospital, all her worldly possessions were still in that house from which she'd been banished. Her clothes, her family photo albums, the patchwork quilt her grandmother had sewn decades ago, everything remained beyond that locked door. Will I ever get any of it back? She wondered, a fresh wave of despair crashing over her. She realized she had been asking the wrong question all along. It wasn't why her son had done this. Perhaps she would never truly know. The question that mattered now was, what will I do? The answer was already stirring quietly within her. Like the first hint of dawn after the darkest night, in the darkness she felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over her. She thought of Darnell. Not with bitterness, but with a distant, compassionate hope that life might teach him gentleness someday. She had done what she could. The rest was in God's hands. With a content sigh, Matilda closed her eyes. Outside, a solitary rose petal, loosened by the night breeze, drifted down from the bloom and came to rest on her windowsill. In her sleep, Matilda dreamed not of heartbreak or rain, but of gentle sunlight and blooming gardens. Sunlight crept into the motel room through the thin curtains, waking Matilda from a shallow, dreamless sleep. Every muscle in her body protested as she sat up. A dull ache radiated from her side, and her head throbbed from the previous night's tears. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, or why. And then it all rushed back in a painful wave. The hospital, the phone call, the locked door, and Chantel's venomous words. Matilda closed her eyes, steadying herself with a few slow breaths. There was no time to collapse again. She had to figure out what to do next. After washing up and gingerly dressing in the spare outfit from her hospital bag, Matilda checked out of the Traveler's Inn. The morning air was crisp and cool, carrying the smell of wet pavement and fallen leaves. Under the bright Alabama sun, the horrors of last night took on a surreal quality. It almost felt like a bad dream. Almost. If not for the persistent throb in her side and the emptiness in her heart. Matilda knew she couldn't linger in limbo. She had a modest amount of cash in her purse and a credit card, but those would only last so long. More urgently, the question of her home and future loomed. Her thumb hovered over her phone, tempted to call Darnell once more, to demand an explanation, to scream at him, perhaps to beg. But then she remembered his cold finality on the phone and the dark house that greeted her. Number. She would not subject herself to that again. Her son had made his choice painfully clear. Still, she needed guidance. As she slid into the rented sedan, Matilda found herself driving not toward the ruins of her old life, but toward the First Jefferson Bank downtown. James had always said, "In a crisis, stick to what's solid." And in their lives, nothing had been more solid than the little nest egg and important documents they kept locked away at the bank. Pulling up to the red brick building, Matilda recalled how she and James had gotten a safe deposit box here when they bought their house. He had insisted on storing copies of wills, the deed, and other vital papers securely. At the time, she'd teased him for being so cautious. Now that foresight might be exactly what she needed. Inside the bank's hushed lobby, an empathetic manager helped Matilda access the small safe deposit box in a private viewing room. With trembling fingers, Matilda lifted the metal lid and saw the familiar manila envelope labeled Will and Estate Johnson. Her breath caught as she pulled it out. She remembered when James had first drawn up their wills after his health scare years ago. They had done it to protect her and Darnell, never imagining such a scenario as this. Swallowing hard, Matilda carefully opened the envelope. On top lay James's will, the document that had left everything to her when he passed. Beneath it was another folded sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges. She recognized her husband's neat handwriting at once. Her chest tightened. It was a letter addressed to her. With watery eyes, Matilda unfolded the note. The date on it was 10 years ago, around the time Darnell married Chantel. James must have written it not long before his death. Hands shaking, she began to read. "My dearest Maddie, if you are reading this, it means you've been hurt deeply by someone we love. I pray that day never comes. But if it does, I want you to remember something. You are the mistress of our family's fate now. Every asset, every bit of property, it's yours to do with as you see fit. Don't you hesitate, sweetheart. If our own blood ever betrays you, you have my blessing to use everything we built in whatever way gives you peace and dignity. Our home, our savings, they're yours alone. Do what's right in your heart. I have faith in you, always. With love, James." By the time she finished, Matilda's cheeks were wet with tears. Her James, even from the grave, he had found a way to put his arms around her. He had foreseen, perhaps in fearful whispers he never spoke aloud, that their son might one day lose his way, and he had left her this guiding light for the darkest of times. Matilda pressed the letter to her heart, closing her eyes. In that quiet room with the scent of aged paper and a decade of memories flooding back, she could almost feel James's strong, reassuring hand on her shoulder. He was telling her it was all right. She still had control of her life story, if only she would claim it. When she finally emerged from the room, the bank manager gave her a concerned look, noticing her red eyes. Matilda managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she murmured, clutching the envelope with newfound resolve. Back in the driver's seat of the car, Matilda sat for a moment absorbing what she had read. The ache of last night's betrayal was still there, yes, but now it was tempered by something else, something almost like solace. James believed in her. He entrusted everything to her judgment, should the worst come to pass. Well, the worst had come to pass, and that meant she now had a momentous decision to make. Matilda inhaled slowly, feeling a calm determination take root where despair had been. Her husband's letter had not only given her permission, but a mission. The assets that Darnell and Chantel no doubt counted on inheriting were, in fact, entirely under Matilda's control. She thought of the house, her house, even if she could not step foot in it at the moment. She thought of the modest savings and investments she and James had nurtured through frugal living and hard work. All of it was meant for family. If her family had cast her aside, then perhaps that legacy could be put to better use. Sitting there in the sunlight outside the bank, Matilda realized she did have options, choices beyond despair. A week ago, she would have imagined no circumstance under which she'd disinherit her only child. But that was before he left her at a hospital and slammed the door on her in the rain. Blood ties or not, what Darnell had done was unforgivable, and James had seen fit to give her permission to respond as she saw fit. Matilda's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. She knew what she had to do. In her mind's eye, she saw another woman, one perhaps much like herself, an elderly mother, frightened and alone with nowhere to turn. There were many out there, women discarded by those who should cherish them. The thought sparked a small flame of purpose in Matilda's chest. She would take the cruelty she'd endured and shape it into something good. If her own flesh and blood believed she belonged in some faceless institution, then she would make sure the inheritance they expected never went to lining their pockets. Instead, it would go toward helping those very people that Chantel had mockingly consigned her to, the elderly who needed aid and compassion. As Matilda started the car, a steely resolve settled over her. The hollow emptiness that had threatened to consume her was filled now with a righteous determination. Her son had erased her from his life, now she would erase him from her legacy. She pulled out of the bank parking lot with a clear destination in mind. First, Jefferson Bank was only a few blocks from her lawyer's office, and by God, she was going to pay him a visit today. Matilda straightened in the driver's seat, feeling for the first time in days a sense of true control. James had given her the pen. Now it was time to write her own ending to this story. It was nearing noon when Matilda pushed open the heavy oak door to the office of Harold Thompson, the attorney who had handled James's estate years ago. The receptionist, surprised to see Matilda without an appointment, ushered her into a leather-upholstered waiting chair. Within minutes, Mr. Thompson, a balding man with kind eyes who remembered Matilda well, emerged to greet her. "Mrs. Johnson, is everything all right?" he asked gently as he led her into his office. Matilda realized she must look as ragged as she felt, but there was no room for embarrassment now. "I'm afraid I need your help, Harold," she replied, voice steady. Once seated across from him at his polished mahogany desk, Matilda clasped her hands tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. It's about my will." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, concern creasing his brow. He'd been James and Matilda's lawyer for ages. He had drawn up their wills and knew their family. "Of course. What would you like to change?" Matilda drew a breath. This was it, the moment to speak aloud the decision that would redraw her family's future. Her throat felt dry. "I want to make a new will," she began quietly. "I need to ensure that my son Darnell does not receive the house or any of our assets after I'm gone." The attorney could not hide his astonishment. He adjusted his spectacles, searching her face. "Not receive Mrs. Johnson, forgive me. Did I hear correctly? You want to disinherit your son?" The word hung in the air, disinherit. Matilda's heart clenched painfully, even as her resolve remained firm. It was a cruel word for a cruel situation, but it was accurate. "Yes," she said, and though her voice wavered, it did not break. "That is correct." Mr. Thompson leaned forward, concern and curiosity mingling in his eyes. "This is a very serious step. May I ask, what has happened?" Matilda pressed her lips together. The events were still raw, but she forced herself to give a brief, factual account. Her hospitalization, the unanswered calls, and the devastating scene at the house. By the end, Mr. Thompson looked positively ill on her behalf. "My God," he breathed, removing his glasses. "Matilda, I am so sorry." He sat back, absorbing her words. "Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with cutting Darnell out? These decisions can carry a heavy emotional toll." A ghost of a bitter smile flitted over Matilda's face. "A heavier toll than what he's already done?" she replied softly. Her eyes glistened, but she did not cry. She had shed enough tears. "My decision is made. James left everything to me, and I intend to follow his wishes on what to do if this day ever came." Her voice gained strength as she spoke. "I'd like to leave the house, the land, and all our savings to a charitable trust instead, specifically to an organization that helps elderly women who have no one to care for them. If Mr. Thompson was surprised by her specific request. He didn't show it. He gave a solemn nod. "That can certainly be arranged. We'll create a new will establishing the trust as your beneficiary. Do you have a particular charity in mind?" Matilda thought of the small flame of purpose she'd felt earlier. "There's a nonprofit called Safe Harbor Senior Outreach. They run a shelter and services for seniors in need. I want to name them as the beneficiary." They'll know how best to use the assets for women like... She paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. Like me. The lawyer managed a gentle smile. Understood. We can coordinate with them to set up a proper fund, and Darnell... He is to receive nothing, Matilda stated firmly. Saying those words hurt, but it was a cleansing kind of hurt, like pressing on a bruise to expel the bad blood. Explicitly so. I don't want any contest or confusion after I'm gone. Mr. Thompson clicked his pen and began writing notes on a legal pad. I'll draft a new will reflecting your wishes, and we'll have it ready for signing as soon as possible. This afternoon, if you're up to it. I am, Matilda replied without hesitation. She felt strangely calm, as if the chaos around her had finally settled into a clear direction. In the quiet moment after Mr. Thompson stepped out to prepare the documents, Matilda reached into her purse and touched the folded letter from James, drawing strength from his words. She exhaled a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. This decision carved a new path from the wreckage of her old hopes. Though sorrow still lingered, it was now tempered by a sense of vindication and an unexpected peace that her future, at least, was back under her control. As the attorney rose to fetch the necessary forms, he rested a compassionate hand on Matilda's shoulder. You're doing what you feel is right. It's not an easy choice. Matilda looked up at him, her eyes tired but resolute. No, not easy, she agreed quietly, but it is right. And in that moment, as she prepared to put pen to paper and alter the course of her family's legacy, Matilda Johnson knew with unwavering certainty that her story was now back in her own hands. That afternoon, a crisp new will lay on Mr. Thompson's desk, awaiting Matilda's signature. The legal language had been double-checked. Every whereas and hereby in place to ensure her wishes were unambiguous. Matilda sat with the pen in her hand, her fingers hovering just above the dotted line where her name would go. Outside the office window, the autumn sun was beginning to sink, golden in the sky. Dust motes swirled in the slanting light, reminding Matilda of days long past, signing mortgage papers with James when they first bought their home, writing her name on Darnell's birth certificate at the hospital so many years ago. Those signatures had marked happy beginnings. This one felt like both an ending and a new beginning all at once. Her heart thudded in her chest as she steadied the pen's tip on the paper. This was the moment everything would truly change. She paused, taking one last glance at the document. It stated clearly that upon her death, all her property and assets were to fund the Matilda's Haven grant under Safe Harbor Senior Outreach, providing shelter and care to vulnerable elderly women. Darnell's name was nowhere on these pages except to note that he was intentionally left out. Matilda's vision blurred for an instant. In the quiet of the office, she became acutely aware of her own breathing. Mr. Thompson stood respectfully to the side as a witness, saying nothing, giving her all the time she needed. Time seemed to slow. Memories flashed unbidden through Matilda's mind. Darnell, as a chubby-cheeked toddler, running to her with wildflowers clutched in his fist. Darnell at his high school graduation, so tall and proud while she beamed with pride, the sound of his laughter filling her kitchen on holidays. For an agonizing heartbeat, her hand refused to move. Was she really about to sever the last legal tie to the child she had devoted her life to? Her lip trembled, and a lone tear splashed onto the ink beside the signature line. Matilda closed her eyes briefly. I'll always take care of you, Mama. She could almost hear the echo of that long-ago promise from her little boy. The pain of that broken vow cut through her. But in its wake came a stealing resolve. The boy who had made that promise existed only in memory. The man standing behind that locked door last night was someone else entirely. Matilda opened her eyes and straightened her spine. With a deep, shuddering breath, she pressed the pen to the paper and signed her name in flowing script, Matilda Louise Johnson. The pen's ink glided smoothly, a dark line etching her final act of independence. With that stroke, it was done. A soft exhale escaped Matilda's lips. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath again. Mr. Thompson gently rotated the document toward himself and added his own signature as witness, followed by his notary stamp. The sharp clap of the stamp's seal rang out like a gavel, an irreversible verdict on the matter. It was over. Matilda sat back in her chair. A strange lightness enveloped her, as if gravity had eased its hold. She felt drained and shaky, but also relieved. Her tears had dried on her cheeks, leaving salt tracks and a tired calm. In the silence that followed, she realized her hands were no longer trembling. They lay still and steady on the desk. "Do you need a moment?" Mr. Thompson asked softly, sliding the completed will into a folder. Matilda managed a small, brave smile. "No, thank you, Harold," she replied. Her voice was raw but clear. "I'm all right." And she meant it. In an unexpected way, she truly was all right. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt an inkling of peace. As the attorney left her alone briefly to make copies, Matilda gazed out that sunlit window. The late-day sky was painted with streaks of orange and rose. She hadn't noticed earlier, but the rain clouds had long since cleared. It was a beautiful autumn evening out there, calm and golden, as if the world was offering a gentle apology for the previous night's tempest. Matilda allowed herself a moment to simply breathe in and out, absorbing the finality of what she had done. There would be no going back now. When she died, Darnell would inherit nothing of the legacy he had expected. Last night, he had told her to stay where she belonged, like an unwanted burden. Now she had made sure that he too would remain exactly where he had chosen to stand, outside the door of her life and outside the door of her estate. There was heartbreak in that knowledge, yes, but there was also justice. Matilda placed a hand over her heart, feeling it beat steady and sure. "James," she whispered under her breath, a faint smile touching her lips. "We did it. I did what you told me." In that hushed office, she could almost imagine James standing beside her in approval, and countless women she had yet to meet, women who would one day sleep safely or receive care because of what she'd done today, gathering around her in quiet thanks. When Mr. Thompson returned, Matilda rose to her feet. "It's all in order," he said gently, offering her the formal copies. "I'll file this with the court by tomorrow." Matilda accepted the paperwork. The burden that had weighed her down felt lighter now, replaced by a sense of closure. "Thank you," she replied, and they weren't just words of courtesy. They were words for James, for the universe, for herself. "Thank you." Clutching the folder to her chest, Matilda stepped out of the attorney's office into the crisp evening air. The sun was setting in a brilliant blaze, gilding the streets of Birmingham in soft light. She stood for a moment on the sidewalk, watching the sky, and let out a long breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It was done. Her fate was once again her own. And as Matilda Johnson walked to her rented car under the wide Alabama sky, she felt something unexpected swelling in her chest, something almost like pride. In the twilight of her life, she had faced the worst storm imaginable and emerged not defeated but determined. She had taken back her story, and in doing so found that her voice, quiet but unwavering, had been there within her all along. 2 days later, Matilda returned to the house on Magnolia Lane, not alone this time, but accompanied by a local police officer and a locksmith. The late morning sun was bright as the cruiser pulled up behind her rental car. Matilda's stomach fluttered with nerves, but she kept her chin high. She had unfinished business here, retrieving the personal belongings and memories that remained within those walls. Legally, the house was still hers, and she wasn't going to leave the things dearest to her behind. Officer Ramirez, a sturdy middle-aged man with a sympathetic manner, stepped up to the front door with Matilda. At her request, he had agreed to oversee the peaceful collection of her possessions. The young locksmith was already at work. Within minutes, the new lock that Darnell had installed clicked open under the locksmith's practiced tools. Matilda's heart pounded as the door swung in. She hadn't stepped foot inside her home since before the surgery. The familiar scent of lemon cleaning polish and old wood wafted out, and for an instant, her eyes stung with tears. Steeling herself, Matilda crossed the threshold. Darnell and Chantel were in the living room. They spun around at the intrusion, eyes widening in shock. Chantel, wrapped in a silk robe, recoiled as if she'd seen a ghost. Darnell stood up from the couch, his face draining of color. "Mama," he started, a mix of surprise and apprehension in his tone. Matilda held up a hand, quieting him. She felt oddly calm as she surveyed the two of them standing in what was once her loving home. The rose-patterned sofa, the family portraits on the wall. It all looked exactly as before and yet utterly transformed, tainted by what they'd done. Officer Ramirez cleared his throat. Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Johnson is here to collect her personal belongings. We have legal authority to be here. Let's keep this civil, all right? Chantel's shock morphed to anger. This is our home now, she snapped, though her voice quivered. She has no right. Matilda met her daughter-in-law's glare with a steady gaze. It is my home, she said softly but firmly. I have every right. Darnell put a hand on Chantel's arm, either to calm her or restrain her. He looked at Matilda, his eyes flicking between the officer and his mother. What is this? He demanded, trying for indignation but sounding unsettled. You can't just barge in. Yes, she can, Officer Ramirez interjected in a professional drawl. Under Alabama law, this property is titled to Matilda Johnson. No change of ownership has been filed. We're here legally? Darnell's jaw tightened. He fell silent, apparently at a loss for how to respond. Matilda noticed he wouldn't quite meet her eyes. Perhaps shame was creeping up on him, or perhaps just frustration at being caught off guard. Without another word, Matilda walked further into the living room. Her footsteps were steady on the hardwood floor. Inside, her heart ached seeing the familiar space. The mantel where James's photo still stood, the afghan she'd knitted draped over her armchair. This had been her sanctuary. Now it felt cold, like a museum exhibit of someone else's life. Chantel hovered near the hallway, her lips pressed into a thin line of rage, but with a policeman present, she didn't dare act out beyond shooting daggers from her eyes. Matilda quietly began to gather what she came for. She picked up the framed family portraits from the wall, one of her wedding day, one of Darnell as a baby giggling in her arms. She folded the old patchwork quilt, the one her grandmother made, and draped it over her suitcase. In the bedroom, she retrieved her jewelry box, the one containing her wedding ring and a few cherished heirlooms. Officer Ramirez followed at a polite distance while she moved room to room, ensuring she was undisturbed. Neither Darnell nor Chantel tried to physically stop her. They simply watched, bristling with impotent resentment. Darnell's face had settled into a hard, defensive mask. Matilda wondered fleetingly if he felt even a shred of remorse watching his mother reclaim these remnants of her life. When she had collected everything meaningful, a handful of photo albums, important documents from the study desk, some personal mementos, Matilda found herself back in the foyer, arms laden with the last box. The officer kindly took it from her to carry outside. The locksmith stood by, having finished changing the locks a second time per Matilda's request. The house key, her key, now dangled new and gleaming from a ring in her hand. Matilda turned to face her son and Chantel. For a moment, none of them spoke. The air was thick with all the words that would never be said. Darnell stared down at the floor, hands balled into fists at his sides. Chantel's eyes burned with outrage and fear of what Matilda might do next. Officer Ramirez stepped outside with the box, giving Matilda a final moment alone with her son and his wife. Matilda inhaled, drawing herself up. There was nothing left to say to the woman who had called her old woman with such cruelty, but to Darnell, her lips parted, searching for any final words that might reach the boy she once knew. Darnell glanced up fleetingly, and in his eyes Matilda caught a flash of something of regret or guilt or simply discomfort. In that flicker, she chose to believe it was remorse. A mother's heart could settle for even the smallest fraction of contrition. "You'll find your things gone when you return," Matilda said quietly, breaking the silence between them. "I've taken what I need. The rest is yours to deal with." Her gaze swept over the home one last time. Chantel sneered, arms crossed tight. "Is that it, then? You done?" Matilda met her hostility with a calm nod. "Yes, I'm done." Without waiting for any further response, Matilda stepped out onto the porch. Behind her, she heard Chantel hiss something under her breath and the soft sound of Darnell shushing her. They did not follow. The officer stood by the cruiser with the last of Matilda's belongings. "Everything okay, ma'am?" he asked. Matilda gave a thin, grateful smile. "Yes, officer." "Thank you kindly for your help," he tipped his cap. "Best of luck to you, Mrs." Johnson Matilda carefully placed the last box of her memories into the trunk of her rented sedan. The police cruiser pulled away from the curb with a brief farewell flash of its lights. The locksmith had departed as well, having rekeyed the front door back to Matilda's specifications and given her the new keys. The street was quiet now, the earlier tension dissipating into the warm afternoon air. She closed the trunk with a firm thud. It was truly done. The house, the belongings, the ties that bound her here. As she moved to the driver's side door, Matilda heard the creak of the porch behind her. Turning, she saw Darnell standing just outside the front door. He had one hand on the doorframe, as if to steady himself. Without the glare of anger or bravado, he suddenly looked small to her, the way he did as a boy, confessing to some mischief, fearful of disappointment. "Mama," he called softly across the front yard. Matilda straightened, one hand on her car's handle. She waited, giving him the chance to speak the words that hung in the silence between them. Darnell took a hesitant step forward onto the porch. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he opened his mouth as if to say something, but no sentence formed. Perhaps he wanted to apologize, or perhaps he still sought to justify what he had done. In the end, all that came was a strained whisper. Where will you go?" It was such a childlike question that Matilda's heart gave a twist. For a moment she saw not the grown man who had abandoned her, but the little boy who used to cling to her skirts, afraid of the dark, but that boy was gone, and the man before her had to face the consequences of his choices. "I have a place to stay," Matilda replied evenly. "Don't worry about me, Darnell." "Worry about yourself." He flinched, and she saw his throat bob as he swallowed hard. "Mama, he started, his voice cracking. "I never meant for it to be like this." A surge of emotion welled in Matilda's chest, a complicated knot of sorrow, love, and hard-earned resolve. She stepped towards the foot of the porch steps, close enough to look him in the eyes. "Maybe not," she said quietly, "but you made it so." Darnell's eyes glistened. He looked down at his feet, silent. From inside the house, Chantel's sharp voice cut through the fragile moment. "Darnell, what on earth are you doing?" "Get back in here!" She appeared in the doorway, her face still twisted in indignation. When she spotted Matilda at the bottom of the steps, she threw her hands up. "This is ridiculous." Let her go, she got what she wanted. Matilda held Darnell's gaze a moment longer. "Listen to your wife," she said, a gentle sadness in her tone. "Take care, son." She almost turned to go, then paused, remembering there was one last truth to deliver. "Oh, and Darnell," she added, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, "I thought you should know. I've rewritten my will." His head jerked up, confusion knitting his brow. Chantel had gone quiet behind him, suddenly alert. "All of it, the house, the land, the money, none of it will come to you now," Matilda said, matter-of-fact and calm. "Not a single penny." Chantel stepped onto the porch, her mouth agape. "What?" she sputtered. You can't do that." Matilda almost smiled at the predictable protest. "I can. And I have," she replied. There was no malice in her voice, only the firm truth. She looked back to Darnell. He had gone ashen, staring at her in disbelief. "One day you'll realize what you lost, and I don't mean the money or the house," she continued, her voice softening. "I truly pray you do realize it." For a long moment, mother and son regarded each other. Darnell opened his mouth as if to speak, to say, perhaps to apologize at last, or perhaps to unleash anger, but no words came. Instead, his shoulders sagged under the weight of Matilda's pronouncement. The reality was sinking in. Chantel recovered her tongue and let out a bitter laugh. "Fine, we don't need anything from you anyway," she spat, though her voice quivered. She grabbed Darnell's arm. "Come inside." Let her leave. Darnell allowed himself to be pulled back a step. Matilda saw tears brimming in his eyes, whether from anger or remorse she might never know. "Goodbye, Darnell," Matilda said gently. offering him a final longing look, a silent benediction for the child she once cradled, now lost to her. He blinked, a tear finally spilling down his cheek. "Goodbye, Mama," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Matilda's throat tightened, but she inclined her head in farewell. There was nothing left to say. She turned and walked back to her car. As she opened the door, she heard Chantel's angry voice faintly, "Get in here now," followed by the door slamming shut. Matilda closed her eyes for a brief second, absorbing the finality of that sound. Then she drew in a breath, seated herself behind the wheel, and started the engine. Without a backward glance, she drove off down Magnolia Lane, leaving the house and the shattered remnants of that chapter of her life behind her. Spring came early to Birmingham the following year. In the courtyard of Safe Harbor Senior Outreach's main center, roses were already budding on the vines that climbed the trellis. Matilda gently loosened the soil around a young rosebush, her gloved hands steady and sure. She had donated a good portion of her savings to expand the center's garden and recreation wing, and in the process, she'd found herself volunteering here a few days each week. It gave her days purpose and her heart comfort. "Miss Matilda, those roses are looking beautiful," called a warm voice from the patio. It was Loretta Green, a widow in her 70s who'd become one of Matilda's close friends over the past months. Loretta was one of the women Matilda's donation had directly helped. After losing her home, Loretta now had a cozy room at Safe Harbor and companionship that kept her smiling. Matilda rose to her feet with a slight wince. Her side still got a bit stiff if she knelt too long. She pulled off her gardening gloves and smiled at Loretta. "Thank you, Loretta." James, my late husband, he loved roses. I planted this one for him. She gently touched a velvety red bud, thinking of the rose garden that had once graced her old yard. That soil was no longer hers, but here new flowers were beginning to bloom. Loretta wheeled her walker closer. "He'd be mighty proud of you, honey," she said, patting Matilda's arm. "We all are." "You gave us a new lease on life, you know." Matilda felt her cheeks warm modestly. "I just did what was right," she murmured. Inside, a group of residents were gathering for an afternoon storytelling session, something Matilda had started, where the seniors took turns sharing tales from their lives. A staff member poked her head out the door. "Miss Matilda, we're ready when you are," she said brightly. "I'll be right in," Matilda replied. She began collecting her tools, and Loretta offered to carry the small trowel. As they walked slowly toward the building together, Loretta chattered about the story she planned to tell that day. Matilda listened with a content heart. In the months since that fateful autumn, Matilda had settled into a modest apartment not far from Safe Harbor. She had sold her house, and ensured the proceeds went straight to the foundation's work. There was surprisingly little sadness in saying goodbye to the Magnolia Lane home. Without love inside it, a house was just walls and roof. Now her resources were helping fill these walls at Safe Harbor with laughter and hope. When Matilda stepped into the bright recreation room, a chorus of greetings met her. "Afternoon, Matilda." "Come sit by me, sugar," several voices beckoned. She moved among them, hugging one lady who was celebrating a birthday, squeezing the hand of another gentleman who had been feeling ill. In their eyes, she saw genuine appreciation and affection, the kind she used to yearn for from her own family. She took her seat at the circle's center. Today, it was her turn to share a story. As curious eyes looked on, Matilda cleared her throat softly. Her gaze drifted to the window where golden spring sunshine streamed in, illuminating motes of dust like tiny stars. She felt calm and strong, no longer afraid of what anyone thought, no longer burdened by bitterness. "I'd like to tell you all about a journey I took," Matilda began, her rich voice carrying across the room with confidence. A hush fell as everyone listened intently. "It's the story of how I learned that sometimes family isn't just blood, it's who stands by you when the rain falls. And how, even in the darkest night, you can find the strength to rewrite your own ending." As Matilda continued, weaving her tale with wisdom and gentle humor, a few of the listeners wiped their eyes. Loretta gave her an encouraging nod. In every word Matilda spoke, there was evidence of the growth and healing that had blossomed in her, like the spring roses outside. She didn't mention Darnell or Chantel by name. There was no need. The story was hers, and ultimately it was about love, loss, and self-respect rather than anger. When she finished, the room burst into applause. Several women dabbed at tears but were smiling. They saw themselves in her story, and her triumph felt like their own. Matilda felt a deep warmth swell in her chest. Sharing her voice, her true, hard-won voice, had become a source of strength not just for her, but for others who needed hope. And in that strength, Matilda had found something else. Forgiveness. She no longer dwelled on anger or hurt. She silently prayed that one day her son would find his own path to kindness, even if it would never intersect with hers again. That evening, Matilda returned to her cozy apartment with a heart full of contentment. The sun had set, and a gentle spring breeze floated through her open kitchen window. On the sill stood a small potted rose plant, a cutting she had taken from the garden at Safe Harbor to nurture at home. Its first blossom had opened that day, a delicate pink flower that perfumed the night air. Matilda brewed herself a cup of chamomile tea and settled into her armchair by the window. The apartment was humble, just a one-bedroom with soft yellow walls and thrift shop furniture she'd picked out with Loretta's help. But it was entirely hers, and filled with peace. The walls were decorated with photographs salvaged from her old home. Her wedding portrait, a snapshot of baby Darnell with birthday cake on his face, a photo of James cradling her hands on their 40th anniversary. They were reminders of a life well lived and lessons well learned. Sipping her tea, Matilda gazed at the rose plant. She reached out and gently cupped the bloom in her work-worn hand. Its petals were velvety and alive, thriving under her care. She thought of the dark night months ago when she sat alone in a dingy motel, feeling broken and discarded. How far she had come since then. On the side table lay a leather-bound journal, a gift from the Safe Harbor staff on her last birthday. Matilda opened it to a fresh page and began to write in her neat cursive, "Dear James, it's spring and the roses are blooming. You'd love the garden here. I think you'd be proud of me. I found where I belong. Our family turned out different than we hoped, but I've made a new family from love, not blood." She paused, tapping the pen thoughtfully. A late-night train whistle sounded in the distance, a lonely yet hopeful sound. Matilda continued writing, pouring onto the page her gratitude for the second chance she'd found, the women who became sisters to her, the relief of useful work, the quiet joy that visited her now in place of sorrow. When she finished, Matilda closed the journal and breathed deeply. She realized she was truly happy, not the giddy happiness of youth, but a deeper, steadier kind, the kind that comes after surviving a storm and seeing a tranquil dawn. As she prepared for bed, Matilda took one last look at the rose on her windowsill. In the silvery glow of moonlight, its petals seemed to shine with their own gentle light. She remembered something her grandmother used to say. "Flowers bloom where they are planted if they're tended with care." Matilda had finally planted herself in a place where she could bloom again, surrounded by people who cared. She whispered a soft prayer into the quiet apartment, a prayer of thanks for the strength to endure, for the guidance that had led her here, and even for the hard lessons that taught her her own worth. Tomorrow promised to be another full day at Safe Harbor. There were more stories to hear, more garden beds to tend, more laughter to share over morning coffee. Matilda turned out the light and climbed into bed, pulling a handmade quilt, a gift from the ladies at the center, up to her chin. In the darkness, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over her. She thought of Darnell, not with bitterness, but with a distant, compassionate hope that life might teach him gentleness someday. She had done what she could. The rest was in God's hands. Sunlight peeked through Matilda's curtains at dawn, painting golden stripes across the quilt. She woke slowly, peacefully, the remnants of sweet dreams fading like the stars. For a moment, she simply lay there, listening to the cheerful chirp of sparrows outside her window and feeling the gentle warmth of morning on her face. When she rose and opened the window, a soft breeze carried the scent of roses from the courtyard below. Matilda noticed a single rose petal resting on her windowsill, delicate and pink. She lifted it between her fingers and smiled, thinking of how far she had come and how James must be smiling down at her this very moment. Pressing the petal into her journal like a precious bookmark, Matilda breathed in the new day. It was another chance to tend her garden, to share her story, to embrace the life she had rebuilt from the ashes of heartbreak. Her journey had taught her that even the cruelest storms pass, and when they do, the flowers find a way to bloom again. With a light heart, Matilda Louise Johnson stepped forward into the day, ready to see what new hope it would bring. The past was behind her, the future lay open, and she, at last, was the author of her own fate.